Okay, I think we're starting now, so please take a seat. Okay, so we're running a little bit late because there were some presentations that ran late, but now we're good to go. So it's me again. You will have heard from me before, but just to introduce myself in case someone doesn't know who I am, my name is Margrethe Brunvåge, and I'm proud to welcome you to this roundtable. So I'm on the board of directors of the SCSMI, but I also serve on our Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Committee, so in short, the DEI committee, and it is in this latter capacity that I sit here today. So this year, the committee has consisted of myself and Dan Flory, who's there, who was the chair of the committee, and Rikke Schubert, who's also there, and then Katalin Brylla, who is going to chair this roundtable with me as co-chair. So the DEI committee was formed 2 years ago to explore ways to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion in the SSMI. And this is a process that many academic societies and universities are exploring. So the committee, and indeed this roundtable, are intended to support the society's interdisciplinary ethos by expanding our dialogue with other fields. Fields and disciplines that may resonate or complement or are in any other way related to the cognitive and philosophical, aesthetic, neurophysiological and evolutionary psychological approaches in the analysis of film and other moving image media. So in the committee, we have worked to put this on the agenda in various ways. We have made a statement on DEI policy. We have worked on guidelines for a travel award for those working on DEI-related questions or being from underrepresented groups in the SCSMI. We have contacted special interest groups in adjacent fields and encouraged them to attend our conferences. And this year we're also then organizing this roundtable discussion on DEI matters for the first time in our society. So the background for this roundtable is that we want to encourage more research on questions that are related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. However, it's an open question what this means, right? What kind of research would promote diversity, equity, and inclusion? So this is the question that we want to put on the agenda today. So we have invited 3 internationally renowned scholars whom we think can shed light on this important question to get the discussion going. So this proposed roundtable can, we believe, encourage more research about the social, cultural contexts of media production, consumption, and also theorizing. And we hope that this can be the first of many sessions that can serve to expand the reach of our interdisciplinarity in a way that would increase diversity, equity, and inclusion and forge new connections and open up some exciting new avenues for research. So we do not envisage that this is the session on DEI questions in the SCSMI, but rather one first step, the first of many sessions perhaps, in what will hopefully be a series of kind of expanding circles, highlighting interdisciplinary links and connections to research with a DEI perspective. So the 3 speakers in our roundtable have researched issues that are relevant to diversity, equity, and inclusion and social impact. In particular, they have done audience research in relation to stereotypes and stigma and on social cognition studies. So just to explain how we're going to proceed in the next 70 minutes or so, first, each speaker has been asked to present their work for 10 minutes each. We have asked the speakers to send each other's questions beforehand and asked them to incorporate these questions in their summaries. So this is the first part of the roundtable. And then we will ask each speaker to reflect on the specific questions that we will return to, thus encouraging a more open discussion for perhaps 15 minutes or so before we turn to you, the audience, for questions and comments for the final 20 minutes or so. First of all, however, I would like to offer my heartfelt thanks to our 3 speakers and to welcome them. So let me first introduce them, keeping it general, as the speakers will, of course, shortly summarize their own research that is particularly relevant to this DEI roundtable. So Meghan Sanders is Associate Professor at Louisiana State University, specializing in media and psychology, focusing on the psychological effects of mass media in terms of psychological and subjective well-being. Her research looks at enjoyment and appreciation of entertainment, morality, narrative engagement, positive media psychology, stereotypes, race, gender, and impression formation. She serves as director of the Media Effects Lab, a research facility dedicated to exploring the underlying thought processes and emotions associated with using mediated communication. The lab uses experimental and survey methodologies to explore communication innovations and technologies and uncover trends in mass communication using innovative instruments and biometric technologies. And Edward Schiappa is Professor of Comparative Media Studies and Writing and holds the John E. Butchard Chair of Humanities at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He conducts research in argumentation, persuasion, media influence, and contemporary rhetorical theory. In his book, Beyond Representational Correctness, Rethinking Criticism of Popular Media, he advocates for more media audience research and argues that the notion of ideal, quote-unquote, representational correctness of different groups of people is misguided and an impossible goal. In 2016, he and his co-authors of the Parasocial Contact Hypothesis received an award for the work that has pioneered the incorporation of destigmatization models in media studies, and that has become a stimulus for new conceptualizations of communication phenomena. And finally, Jens Eder holds an interdisciplinary professorship for storytelling and aesthetics at the Film University Babelsberg, Conrad Wolf. He will be a familiar face to many of you, and he gets to represent an SCSMI member who has turned to questions of political web with videos, divergent audience responses, and the political impact of media in recent studies. Last year, he co-organized with Katalin a symposium on the social impact of audiovisual media, which has resulted in an online repository for researchers, practitioners, tutors, and students. And Jens studied philosophy and literature with a focus on media, and he has worked for several years in media practice, including the field of screenwriting. He's written extensively on the construction of media characters in fiction and documentary film, addressing issues of representation, social identity, stereotyping, and empathy. And without any further ado then, I will ask the first speaker to start, and I thought I'd ask Meghan to start, followed by Edward, and then finally turn to Jens. And I'll give you a warning about, when you have about 2 minutes left.
So that age-old question, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
I believe so. Okay, great. Thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of today's roundtable. Thank you to Catalin and Margarita and the rest of the DEI committee for the invitation. And so I thought I would start by just talking generally about how I approach my own research, some of my more recent research, and talk a little bit about how it connects to DEI specifically. In terms of the overview of my recent work, I am a social psychologist, and so I approach the vast majority of my research from that perspective, focusing on cognition and affect. Really with a sense of understanding audience reactions and audience perceptions and interpretation of entertainment narratives. My overall aim with my research is to better understand how entertainment specifically can do good by or through challenging audiences. And so there's a larger body of research labeled meaningful media experiences that argues that media experiences can encourage thoughts about purpose in life, self-reflection, and introspection. But the narratives can also encourage us to think about ourselves in connection with others, the interconnectedness, our relatedness with others, as well as seeing a sense of ourselves in others. And so underneath that umbrella of meaningful media experiences has focused primarily on how entertainment media can lead or encourage thoughts of social consciousness and awareness among entertainment consumers. And when I say social consciousness, I'm talking about this idea or the degree to which we are aware that we're part of a larger interrelated community, the sense that we have a reciprocal influence on what happens to others, and they also have an influence on what happens to us. This sense of social consciousness or awareness can be triggered by dissonance between our own needs and those of societies, really resulting in a need to be responsible for others. And so when I'm talking about this, I'm really talking about this understanding of the role that entertainment exposure narratives can play in this increased sense of social consciousness. And thinking about socially conscious entertainment specifically, I'm talking about narratives that challenge cultural values and identities related to equity and human existence. So I'm really talking about entertainment narratives that not only entertain, but can enlighten audiences by raising awareness about specific issues, by encouraging discussion about them, and or providing explanations for current political and social issues, with the overall hope of providing avenues for people to connect with one another on a larger human scale, human plane, but also encourage thoughts and behaviors connected to social change and advocacy on behalf of others. And so in a series, I'm going to talk very quickly about a series of studies that I've conducted, and I'm happy to answer more detailed questions in Q&A, but also outside of this venue. But in a survey that I conducted of US respondents, just generally getting a sense of how they define socially conscious entertainment or conceive of it, the vast majority of the respondents said that they think about moving images when they think about narratives that fit the mold of what I've just described. A small percentage of people also mentioned that they think about music and specific musical artists when they think about socially conscious entertainment. In terms of what the narrative contains, they reported that the narrative will focus on explicitly or implicitly on some sort of social issue. It may raise awareness or create a learning opportunity for a particular issue, or it may simply involve the presence and a complexity of representation of people from marginalized, stigmatized, or underrepresented groups. One thing to note about socially conscious narratives, we're talking also about a range of genres, from dramas to comedies to reality shows, as well as documentaries. And we're also talking about a number of formats, as you see here, from moving images to music, but also to social media and video games as well. In the survey, respondents also said they felt like they were fairly likely to encounter socially conscious themes in their entertainment experiences. They very often seek it out. This particular result was in connection to specific types of entertainment motivation. So people who are making their entertainment selections more so based on the need for personal growth and self-reflection are more likely to seek out this type of entertainment. But also when it's present, they are likely to discuss it with others. And in terms of its presence, the narrative can include some type of, can be explicit in terms of its mention of social consciousness and social justice themes, but we're also talking about instances where a theme may serve as a subplot or even as a metaphor. And an example of that might be a film like Avatar, in which the narrative served as a metaphor for climate change and colonialism as well. In terms of impact on attitudes, preliminary experiments have shown that the story and the characters matter. Engagement with narratives, both through the story and with the characters, are highly influential on attitudes. So the more we feel as though we are a part of the story, the more likely there is to be some type of factor in our attitudes related to social justice and interests related to social justice. The degree to which we identify or have a psychological convergence with the characters featured also is highly associated with an increased interest in social justice. In terms of emotional responses, experiencing both positive as well as negative emotions also have an increased influence on social justice attitudes, but also the genre matters to some extent. The nature of these relationships between these variables or these factors and social justice attitudes does differ depending on whether we're talking about a drama, talking about a comedy, or talking about an animated film, such as The Incredibles 2, which had themes related to gender equity, or even a popular film like Zootopia, which had metaphors related to race-based discrimination. Share just a little bit about another study that I'm in the process of analyzing the data for that really focuses on in-group experiences. A lot of the research within social psych tends to focus on the out-group experiences and attitudes and psychological mechanisms for very good reason, because people within the out-group tend to have the majority of the power and structural power that tends to lead to prejudice and discriminatory behavior. But that's not to negate the importance of understanding the experiences of in-group members. And so in the summer of 2020 in the US and in instances around the world, we saw a lot of Black Lives Matter protests taking place, particularly in response to the murder of George Floyd in Minnesota. We also saw a number of companies making explicit and releasing statements in support of Black Lives Matters. And the streaming services were no exception. We saw a lot of streaming services, particularly US subscribers in particular, saw a lot of streaming services creating new categories of content and highlighting them when you logged in that said Black voices matter, Black stories matter. And so I conducted a survey of Black American respondents to get a gauge as to how they felt about seeing these particular actions taken by the streaming services. Did they view them as authentic? Did they view them as something that was actually helpful to the movement? And so respondents were asked a series of questions, including how important they thought it was that Black stories were highlighted, but also perceptions of the content that the streamers were actually highlighting as a result of these categories. And so respondents very quickly felt that Netflix was doing the best job in terms of providing the most diverse stories. And in terms of their perceptions, they did think it was incredibly important to tell Black stories, but they also felt like the categories were only moderately meeting their personal needs to see entertainment featuring Black experiences. In terms of kind of understanding whether audiences were excited or disappointed with the content that was provided, the vast majority of individuals said that they were excited, but it was still a mixed bag. In terms of excitement, people felt like the visibility was great, that they could see a wider range of talent being featured, and that they had options in which they could view new stories that they typically wouldn't have had access to. And they saw that these categories as acknowledgement by the streaming services that they as an audience were of value to media industries. But there was also a sense of disappointment because they felt at the same time that they were seeing the same tropes and characters and stereotypes. They really felt like the streamers were really more so posting older content as clickbait for Black streamers instead of putting funding behind newer content and newer voices and newer creators. So they were essentially creating a non-solution solution. And they also felt like this was something that should have happened a really long time ago instead of in response to the Black Lives Matters protests. In terms of people's perceptions of the content itself on a 1 to 5 scale, respondents felt like it only moderately challenged Black stereotypes. There was a moderate variety of stories about Black communities and experiences, stories that encourage pride, and stories that also contributed to unconscious bias to a modest degree were still present. Less present, a little less present emphasis on Black trauma stories, the featuring of characters with a little depth and the content, this feeling that the content was not very thoughtfully chosen. So as this relates to thoughts for strengthening research in inclusion, diversity, equity, and access, I feel like this is really my sense of opening up a broader discussion in terms of opening up, being open to new perspectives and methodologies, but also open to collaboration and being willing to admit what we don't know, what we wish we knew more about, and finding those people who do. I think that we have to be very intentional and particular in collaborations, especially when it comes to this kind of research that has that could have a very specific societal impact. I would also encourage individuals to take the time to find out what is already there and engage in conversation with the scholars who are already doing the work. There are experts out there in many, many different ways. And this may not come in the form of published pieces. There are a variety of reasons why a piece may not leave a conference format, but that doesn't mean that the research can't and shouldn't be built upon and amplified. I think that we should also think of additional ways to bring together questions of in-group, out-group experiences and how they relate to one another comparatively, but also questions that are driven by structural and corporate decisions, as you saw with the second study that I shared with you all. And finally, I think it's important to recognize that there's diversity within communities worthy of understanding. So how Black American audiences may respond to one piece of content may be very different from how Black African audiences respond to that same piece of content, which may be different from how Black Europeans respond, which may be different from how Afro-Latinos respond. So with that, I feel like I'm right at the edge there. So I will stop talking and sharing and turn everything over, back over to the rest of the panel.
Thank you so much, Meghan. Thank you. Edward. Edward, you go ahead.
Okay. I hadn't really planned on doing slides, but I was so inspired. I'm going to see if I can do this without making a fool of myself. I think the answer to that is no. So I'm just going to chat for a while here and explain where my research was coming from. So I was actually trained in rhetorical studies, which is basically a sort of, text-oriented discipline. And at the same time, I was in a communication department that included a variety of different types of scholars and methodology. And I've never felt too constrained by the discipline in terms of what I could potentially do as a scholar. And a little over 20 years ago now, I was getting increasingly sort of agitated over certain kinds of claims that scholars were making on purely textual analysis of popular media. And what bothered me about it was that there was sort of a formula to it, which is this text might look progressive, it might look socially conscious, but if you decode it the right way, you'll see that it's actually repressive in A, B, or C manner. And I just felt like that kind of textual-based analysis was missing an important part of the picture, which of course is the audience. And so in the late 90s, which now seems like a long time ago, a then graduate student and I did an article that basically argued for doing more audience research if you want to advance certain kinds of claims about texts. If you want to make claims about their definitive meaning or about their potential effects, then you really need to do some kind of audience research. Not long after we did that, an article came out about the TV show Will and Grace that basically argued this may seem progressive, but in fact it promotes heteronormativity in A, B, and C manner. And without trying to defend that show as ideal representation, which of course I don't think is possible, that once again motivated me to collaborate with colleagues, Peter Gregg and the late Dean Hughes, on a series of experiments and survey research that tried to get into the audience research. And that led to what we now call the parasocial contact hypothesis. And the idea is fairly simple. In social psychology, the contact hypothesis has been around for 70 years or so now. Hundreds and hundreds of studies have shown that a path towards reducing, not eliminating, but reducing prejudice is getting to have positive contact under certain circumstances with groups with whom you're not familiar. Hundreds of studies literally around the world. And meanwhile, in our little siloed discipline of communication over here, we have this notion of parasocial interaction, which says that, hey, you learn about people, you develop opinions about people, even if you only know them through mediated form. So we simply smushed the two together and said, well, can we reduce prejudice through parasocial or mediated contact? We did a series, as I said, of experiments on that found, in fact, yes, you can. And that the key, just as Gordon Albert said back in 1954, was differentiating your category, going from a narrow stereotypical category where you define a group of people by one or two characteristics, and then by exposure to multiple examples, you realize, oh, that category is more complicated than that, that leading to a decrease in prejudice. Alport was very optimistic. He said that he believed that prejudice was rooted in ignorance, and I think certainly part of it is. And that's something that parasocial contact can reduce. A couple other things we found in our research is that, a strong attachment to a character who represents a group with whom you're not previously familiar, that can reduce prejudice. Even finding certain representative characters in a show who you find as physically attractive correlated with reduced prejudice. So all of that goes to say that something that everybody, I think, here today would obviously agree, which is representation matters. And now we have a growing body of empirical research that documents that prejudice can be reduced through mediated contact, and that representation matters. A related point to that that was mentioned in my little introduction was this idea of avoiding the myth of ideal representation. I don't know that we're completely past that, but I think we're moving past that. And because what happens so many times is a new show comes along and someone will say, well, I like this aspect of the characterization, but I don't like this one. And this is something that I address in the book that was mentioned, Beyond Representational Correctness. Quick advert. Anybody who wants a free digital copy of that book, just send me an email. I'm happy to share it in PDF form. My email address is my last name, schiappa@mit.edu. Happy to share a PDF of the book. But the point, and here again, I was reacting. I'm a former high school and college debater, and I was reacting to what I thought were problematic arguments. And there was a very good scholar who I respected who was doing a feminist critique of media portrayals. But I felt she was creating a catch-22. So she was talking about representation of women, of female characters, and she criticized Mary Tyler Moore for being sort of essentially too stereotypically feminine and caregiver in certain respects, and then turned around and criticized Murphy Brown for being not feminine enough and too masculine. And so part of what I explore in an early chapter of the book is that any one representation can't do it all. We can make certain characteristics that may be considered stereotypical more positive with a positive valence, such as Mary Tyler Moore, or we can prove that that category is not defined by that attribute by counter representations like Murphy Brown. And the key being, again, a theme that I think everybody here knows, the more representation, the better. The greater variety of representation, the better, because again, going back to cognitive psychology, people are learning from that. And Gordon Albert says a differentiated category is the opposite of a stereotype. I obviously committed that to memory because I thought it was so central that, you know, the more attributes you associate with a particular category of people, then the less likely you are to reduce them to a prejudicial stereotype. And in our most carefully conducted Solomon Foursquare designed experiment, that's what we found, is that the more people learned about a category, in this particular case, gay men, from the original Queer Eye show, which had 5 gay men on it. So lots of data, lots of learning going on about what the characteristics and attributes are of gay men. The more that they learned, the more that their prejudice went down, comparing pre-test and post-test. So that research originally came out in 2005, which is, I realize, an increasingly distant date. But as you can check on Google Scholars, a lot of people have cited it, and a lot of people have done work under making a similar argument whether they use the terminology of parasocial contact or not. And I'm delighted and thrilled by that. And again, sometimes applying it in expected ways, sometimes unexpected ways. The most recent one, which I talk about in a book that I just had come out called Transgender Exigency, I summarize some of the research that's been done specifically on how transgender representation can decrease prejudice, and how we see an increasing amount of such representation in at least American television. So, you know, I'm at 9 minutes right this second, so I think I'm going to go ahead and wrap up there. But that's where my research was coming from, and I just want to be honest, it was a reaction to what I felt was overly text-oriented research, and that if we want to advance certain kinds of claims, that we need to add that audience research. And that's probably uncontroversial for this particular audience, but at the time, you know, it challenged certain norms that had emerged, particularly with a lot of media critics in the communication discipline. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Edward. That's great. Okay, so yeah, let's.
Thank you.
And then we turn to Jens.
Thanks. For a start, I have to say that in contrast to Meghan and Edward, I'm not really an expert in research on DEI. However, I've been interested in these topics for some time, and I'm convinced that SESMI would greatly benefit from researching them more based on an interdisciplinary exchange. So I'm very grateful to the organizers and the committee for the invitation to this roundtable and the opportunity to learn. In my work, I have been confronted with questions of diversity mostly in 3 contexts: film practice, theory of characters, and the social impact of film. And let me start with film practice. I'm teaching at the Film University Babelsberg, which is at the same time a university specializing on film and the largest film school in Germany. And therefore, I'm teaching not only young media researchers, but also future filmmakers with quite diverse backgrounds who are very aware of the huge problems with diversity in film, and especially the misrepresentation of marginalized social groups. And not only are our students thirsting to change that, but the film industry is also changing. Media companies, professional organizations, streaming services like Meghan pointed us to, and funding bodies call for more diversity. And the question is how this diversity can be achieved. And clearly there's a need for greater diversity in the film industry itself, in the persons. But how can filmmakers also tell more diverse stories with more diverse characters? And there is, I try to share my slides about that. So I hope this works. No, the right one? Okay, this one. There's a rapid spread of diversity courses, consultants, and manuals with titles like Writing Diverse Characters, which are usually not drawing on research. However, the narrative forms that emerge here could, I think, well be examined from the perspective of a poetics of cinema or a poetics of diversity, for instance, by analyzing such guides, similar to the way David Bordwell, Kristin Thompson, and others did years ago. So this would be the field of practice, and this leads directly to my second field, the theory of characters and viewers' responses. How can we account for their social side diversity? What do we have to consider? Currently, I'm revising the English translation of my book on characters, which will come out in a few months. And when starting with the revision of the German edition, which had been published 14 years ago, I was frankly shocked at how little I had actually considered issues of diversity at that time. So I'm trying to improve that in the English version, and I'm aware that several other SESMI scholars have also examined characters and diversity extensively, like Dan Flory, Margrethe, Rike Schubert, Karl Plantinger, Katalin. But there is still a lot to do. And one thing that seems important to me in this respect are character constellations as parasocial and aesthetic systems, including conflicts, hierarchies, and many other interrelations. Where are members of marginalized groups situated in such systems, and how are viewers' attention, emotion, and perspective taking distributed across a constellation, especially concerning marginalized characters? A central example in my book is Casablanca, which is a great film, but look at the number of female main characters in the constellation, or the position of people of color, and I think such constellations could be examined across larger samples of films and genres. Another crucial question is how to model viewers' responses to characters, and I think this is quite complex. The term parasocial interaction already indicates that many theories focus exclusively on characters as represented beings on their physical, psychological, or social traits that elicit sympathy or empathy. According to my approach, viewers' responses are more complex and include further layers, each related to questions of diversity. And I will not torture you with this strange graphic here, diagram here, but turn to an example. This concerns the perception of audiovisual forms, or what might be called an aesthetics of diversity. For example, if a film's lighting is optimized for white skin, black characters and their facial expressions are eclipsed already on the visual level. Richard Dyer has described that as lighting for whiteness. And in contrast, Barry Jenkins's Oscar winner Moonlight, the filmmakers use a specific camera, lighting, and color grading suitable for darker skin tones. And arguably, this influenced also viewers' responses to Chiron, the homosexual black protagonist, by foregrounding his facial expressions and associating him with moods which are quite difficult to verbalize. While such responses occur below the level of parasocial interaction, I would say others go beyond. For example, viewers may reflect on how a character is used by filmmakers to spread didactic or discriminatory messages. When contemporary German viewers watch Veit Harlan's anti-Semitic hate film Jud Süß, for instance, their responses to the protagonists are likely to include thoughts about how the character was instrumentalized by the Nazis in the Holocaust. And this may be an extreme example from the past, but there are analogous cases in the present. I turn to the third field of work I would like to mention here, which is the study of how films, such as the mentioned ones, could have social impact. And Margrethe already mentioned the symposium that Katalin Briller and Tobias Galke and I organized last year. You can find the talks and more information on this website, avimpact.com. And during the last years, Britta Hartmann, Tetja Sukmana, and I have also been researching attention strategies of political videos in social media, such those of the Black Lives Matter movement, videos by feminists, leftists, and environmentalists. And our website contains many video analysis, and there's also a book in the making. As Karl Plantinga also pointed out in his talk yesterday, the effects of media are notoriously difficult to grasp, and my co-speakers know that much better than I do. I think at least 3 different empirical approaches examine multifactorial, dynamic, and transactional effects. Media psychologists use experimental studies and statistics to measure changes in viewers' attitudes before and after watching a movie. And social science researchers use qualitative methods like focus groups to examine effects of, for instance, entertainment education. And practice-led researchers conduct case studies of, for instance, committed documentaries whose effects are strategically planned and monitored. And this last kind of research distinguishes between several levels of effects or steps towards impact, from individual reception to social change, which involve different kinds of interactions. And I think such distinctions could be helpful to locate cognitive theories in a larger context, in this example on the second or third of those steps, and indicate how they could be combined with praxeological approaches to better understand media effects on DEI. I hope that my remarks already indicate that in each of the 3 fields of research we need more comprehensive interdisciplinary theories which take a complex array of factors into account. I think cognitive media theories could contribute to this exchange, and this conviction also underlies my answers to the questions Meghan and Edward sent me before the roundtable. Do I have still some time for that? I can't hear you, so you stop me. Meghan had a very difficult question for me. In my work on characters, I assume that film creators, interpreters, and cultural critics each have different analytical goals, perspectives, and criteria, and that each look at different intended, ideal, or actual audiences. And Meghan asked me how questions of inclusion further complicate these differences and what methodological approaches might allow for us to better understand them. And my brief attempt at an answer would be that each way of analyzing characters and inclusion concerns the diversity not only of the characters themselves, but also the diverse social identities of filmmakers as well as viewers, albeit in different ways. Moreover, each form of analysis will be based on phenomenologically describable social experiences which are associated with certain biases and limits of understanding, emotion, and perspective taking. And I think this is one reason why it is so important that the field of filmmakers and researchers becomes more diverse, and that both do not only look at a dominant majority as possible audience, but also at marginalized viewers. So the last paragraph, Edward asked me why I considered important to study not only film structures, but also audience responses. And here's my tentative answer. I'm convinced that we can only understand the relations between film and DEI if we take both film structures and the minds of specific audiences into account. And on the one hand, many studies show that viewers' responses diverge along the lines of social identities and experiences, so it is not sufficient to posit a universal hypothetical spectator, but we need empirical audience research and psychological models of the crucial differences between minds. And on the other hand, empirical audience studies alone will not be sufficient to understand why and how audiences respond in certain ways to representations of marginalized groups. And for that, we also need complementary models of film's narrative, rhetorical, and aesthetic structures. And it's here where I see an extremely fruitful and necessary exchange of cognitive media studies with approaches in social and media psychology, as Meghan and Edward represent them in such inspiring ways. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much to all three speakers for sharing their fascinating research and ideas with us. We are now going to open up the discussion to them and would like to initiate the discussion with a question on today's agenda, which was what kinds of research Okay, we're back. So we'd like to initiate the discussion between our speakers with the question on today's agenda, which is what kinds of research are important to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion with respect to moving image media. So Meghan, Edwards, and Jens, the floor is yours. Could you hear me?
Yes, Meghan, you go first.
Whoever wants to go first.
That's an interesting question, and I think that you could see from the first series of body of work that I shared with you, it may not necessarily come across as explicitly related to DEI, but very socially relevant. And probably an unsatisfying answer to that question. I think that I'm very driven by research that that inspires questions in me based on what I'm seeing happening around me. And so I think that paying attention to what's happening in the world, paying attention to who we are as media consumers ourselves, can sometimes lead to those important pressing questions related to DEI that maybe we've thought about but haven't taken the time to really push forward, that maybe have never occurred to us to engage with, or that those around us that come from conversations that we're having with those around us. And so I think that in terms of trying to figure out what's socially relevant, I think that just paying attention to the world actually helps us figure out what types of research what type of research we could or should be focused on. Case in point, this body of work that I started about 3 or 4 years ago, it was inspired all by the movie Black Panther. It wasn't a complicated idea, but I'm sure everyone in the room is familiar with the film, but it raised all sorts of questions in the narratives and all kinds of conversations amongst audiences of different backgrounds and different cultures around the world. And it occurred to me, hey, if a Marvel superhero movie can do this and have people talking about questions of colonialism and talking about African countries in a positive light for a change, what else can entertainment experiences do? And so I think, again, just paying attention to what's happening can drive some really, really big questions.
I can add a little bit. I also just wanted to ask if you've seen the comic books that Marvel put out, written by Ta-Nehisi Coates on Black Panther. Okay. Yeah, I collected those for a while. So, because I mean, that's a different audience, obviously. Anyway, I just don't want to go off too far on that. I do love that this panel is happening. I love that this conference is happening, because the key answer to everything is more. More research of a variety of methodologies. I love the mention of the importance of lighting to representation and how that can be influential. I would also add that there's actually research, since so much of our media is consumed through, other than in the movie theater, there is research on how the size of the screen can influence your parasocial experience of those characters. So it's really quite interesting. The other thing that I would add that's a little bit more on point to DEI initiatives is this is a hot button issue on college campuses right now. What are appropriate and potentially inappropriate DEI policies that are being forwarded on college campuses? And one of the research findings has been that if you sort of put people through the sort of standard awareness raising DEI training, it doesn't stick. What changes behavior is actual contact with a diverse population. In other words, hiring a more diverse faculty will change attitudes and behaviors of the faculty as a whole, not just sitting through the obligatory and as soon as it's required, resisted DEI training. And that just sort of seems to me to resonate with what we're saying here about the importance of representation, because again, that is a way we get to know people and categories of people. And somebody mentioned in the comment about intersectionality. Absolutely, it's also media representations, and it doesn't matter if it's fictional or nonfiction, and it doesn't even matter if it's animated. They can all influence attitudes and learning about categories. All right, that's the end for me for now.
So I try my take. So from a theoretical perspective, I would say that on a first level, Grundlagenforschung, foundational research is really important because it provides solid theories and empirical findings that can then serve as a basis to better understand the relations between media and DEI. And you mentioned so interesting things about that already. From a practice-led perspective, I would say that research is important if it's applicable and suitable to inform and shape also media practice. In a very broad way, I think this includes not only media production and distribution, but also reception and enjoyment, and appropriation, programming, curating, funding, education, media literacy, policies, criticism, recommendations, imagining alternatives, and so on. So anything that could inform that, I think any research that could inform that would be helpful. However, to make empirical research and theories accessible for media practitioners and the wider public will be a process of translation that is often not so easy, at least in my experience. So practitioners do not exactly always wait for researchers, but they have to be won over or convinced. And well, and then I think in this, from a methodological perspective, it would be really, really important to have an interdisciplinary exchange between not only applied research and Grundlagenforschung or foundational research, basic research, but also between empirical psychology and sociology on the one hand and approaches in media studies on the other. And the question there would be, how could that happen, and how could we do it? How could we connect? I know that you did this in your work also, or made those steps, and maybe this could be something we could talk about later also.
I think what's interesting here is that we have two intergroup configurations that Jens mentioned. One is between disciplines and another one is between academia and the media industry. And either configuration is beset of stereotypes and stigmatization, which is quite ironic. So how would you three assess the scope of scholars to work with practitioners in order to initiate initiatives or methodologies and incorporate them into media practice for long-term impacts? What would be some of the strategies to link the industry to academia and vice versa, first of all, and secondly, to maybe adapt some of these complicated models, well, not complicated for us, but for the industry, to simplify them and to prompt them to use representational techniques that are based on research, but at the same time can be adapted to media industry formats, economical constraints, and so forth. Because as a media practitioner, I find it's very challenging myself to marry the two, let alone hook up with the industry and sell the models to them.
But you already did it, Katalin. Maybe you can share your experiences about working with the BFI and Channel 4 and so on. That would be interesting.
Well, it's a project that hasn't materialized yet. It's in planning, where we are trying to work with broadcasters in the UK to devise methodologies to destigmatize disability on screen. And one of the key strategies is that we are co-creating the methodologies. And I think it's exactly what you said, Edward, about contact. We're trying to create contact between academics and the industry towards a cooperation, towards a common goal, rather than us presenting them with the models or with the finished toolkits. So it's a kind of mixture between participatory research and collaboration to create these toolkits. But that's just in my example. Maybe you have other case studies that you are aware of collaborations between the industry and the academy.
I think it has to be opportunistic. I mean, if you want to talk about a successful marriage, you would talk about research done for decades on Sesame Street. It's the most studied media content in history, but that's because they had to get grants. And so they learned very early on that if they could document their results and work with scholars to do that, that there could be a fruitful relationship. Again, it has to be opportunistic. I am in touch with a group in India, for example, that is a fortunate result of a person who got a degree at MIT, who went home to India, who is working on how to do socially relevant programming. And they are creating that content. And it's just sort of, it's sort of like getting grants in general. There's no magic formula. You just have to kind of look for the opportunities and exploit them. I would point to a sort of mid-ground between, artists don't like to be told what to do. So I think in an overly didactic approach to artists, you got to be careful about that, or you're going to turn them off. But if you can meet them, a middle ground is organizations like Gina Davis's organization, which has a political cause, has money, and has influence, and then, but it's because they're in between academe and academic research. They have some connections to USC there, and then on the other side, because of Gina Davis, they have the Hollywood connections as well. It's not a very satisfactory answer, but it's just sort of like, if there is an opportunity, you got to take advantage of it.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And the opportunities also lie with the gatekeepers. So if you look at commissioners, for instance, or festival curators, funders, of course, and DEI teams at broadcasters, the ones that create the DI charters and policies. These are big gatekeepers. That's, at least from my experience with Channel 4 and BBC and ITV, I found that they can open a lot of doors. Are there any comments, any other comments about this? No? Shall we open up the discussion to the audience, the physical and the virtual audience? So if there are any questions for our speakers, Carl. We need the microphone.
Thanks to everyone for these wonderful talks. I really enjoyed all three of them. I was contacted, I do some research on ethics of storytelling in audiovisual media, and I was contacted by a producer just a couple of weeks ago, and I put him off, and I'm very glad I did, because I really don't know how to answer his question. He's a TV producer. He works with writers in developing content for streaming, and he said to me, I saw that you're working on this issue. Can you please answer this question for me? What I find is that if a writer approaches a topic with a certain political or moral objective in mind, it often turns out to be a boring or a formulaic story. I mean, you try to fit your intentions into a Procrustean bed, and it becomes too predictable, and people don't enjoy it. How should I work with writers if I want to help them to develop more socially, some morally significant programming? Do any of you have any advice about how I ought to answer this question? I put him off because I'm in Europe now, I'm an American, and when I get back, I'm going to have to talk to him.
Hi, Carl. Good to see you. Well, I'm dealing with this question often when I'm because many of my students in screenwriting, where they are trying to do something that is socially conscious or relevant, but well, the simple answer would be that if they have a theme, a socially relevant theme or topic, everything is still open. They can simply start writing, so that's no problem. This producer could simply say, okay, we are interested in socially relevant themes, and maybe the scripts would be coming in to them. If then working together with those writers, I always say you have to write from your belly, or you have to write intuitively from your heart, spontaneously, and not according to some scheduled plan, but in the rewrites that every script needs, you have to you are able to change so many things and to focus your socially relevant message, and you can do that, I think, without destroying the creativity and the specificity of the material. So that would be my attempt at a short answer to that.
Carl says, thank you, Jens.
I can add a little bit. Megan, do you want to say something?
I'm still ruminating.
Well, I can babble on then a little bit. I just want to point out that, number one, you should tell your writer who's in the room. because that's an important area of representation as well. And you can't tell stories if you don't really know the life experience of certain groups, for example. And so, you know, and that's not news. That's something that advice is making the rounds, but that's something that you can take back as well. I think a recipe for disaster is going in with an overly didactic mission. You know, I am going to create a half-hour show that's going to change the world. You know, it doesn't work that way. But I want to, you know, give people a little more contact with this group or a little more knowledge about this social problem. We did a research project on Michael Moore's documentary, right? So it's nonfiction, Sicko, and found that the power of narrative, the power of these stories that the documentary tells about people whose lives were harmed by insurance companies. This is pre-Obamacare. We measured pre-test and post-test, and it did change minds. And what was interesting is that we saw the biggest change among people who self-identified as conservatives. They found that the stories and the data, if you will, compelling. And we had open-ended questions as well. And then some of them said, I didn't expect to find this radical socialist Michael Moore persuasive, but wow, that data was compelling and these stories were compelling. And so it's not just characters, although we've talked a lot about that today, or I've talked a lot about that today, but it's also the issues that are engaged in the narrative. You can raise people's consciousness to that, but it's got to be good stuff, right? You know, Ellen came out, the show did not do well. It frankly just wasn't as funny a show overall as, for example, Will and Grace was. Will and Grace was just a hilarious show. And, you know, as documented impact as a result. So you got to have quality. You got to have the quality there so people want to watch it and find it entertaining. You know, and that's something Marvel does well with Black Panther. That is something that The Watchmen was just amazing television. And what was, you know, The Watchmen starts off with a very important historical event. But the weaving of the story, I don't know if I can say this right. The show doesn't say, we're going to try to decrease your prejudice towards African Americans and raise your consciousness of African American history. It says, we have this weird story about this, you know, the superpowered people and what happens here and what happens that was incredibly compelling. That also told it, introduced many Americans, I'm sure, to an important history they didn't know about, and featured lead Black characters. That's important work. That's important representational work.
And I would just add to that, because I've had a chance to ruminate now. Why does the creative process have to change because it's a socially relevant, overarching theme or message? I think that when we start to change that, like Edward was saying, it has to still be a compelling story. There still has to be conflict. There still has to be characters for you to connect with and a story for you to engage with. And if those are the elements that are missing, then that's a different conversation. And so my question to that producer would be, why does that creative process have to change just because of the nature of the story?
Perhaps
as a non-writer, that would be my question.
And also, I think it's worth just drawing your attention to one comment in the chat. There's a question: how about making an effort to engage with writers from diverse backgrounds? That might also be a good question, I suppose, to ask. Yeah.
The questions? Yes. Microphone, please.
So my question or comment, well, it's a comment question, has to do more with how you promote and how you create more DEI-related research within a community. It's a tricky thing to do. I think one of the things, and Megan had a slide specifically dedicated to this, certainly widening research questions, methodologies, and this society is amenable. It's one of the most interdisciplinary societies I've been involved with, and it's certainly, you see a diversity of methodologies and research questions. All is possible here. I'm convinced, and I've thought about this in other societies for which I'm in a leadership role, that the secret is young scholars and students, and providing opportunities for explicit opportunities for young scholars who are doing research related to this issue, in part because when you develop affiliation with the society at an early part of your career, you tend to sustain those affiliations. And two, these are individuals who are hungry for new collaborations and opportunities with other scholars that at various levels of their professional development. So that's my comment, and I would love to hear other people's thoughts, in the panel's thoughts.
I would add to that list early career and mid-career scholars as well. People who have been doing the work for a while, but for whatever reason their work has not received the same attention as other types of research or other topics. And so really taking the time to find out just how vast the community already is and providing the opportunities and the opportunities for amplification and collaboration of that work also. So I would add early and mid-career scholars to that list.
Edward or Jens, would you like to comment? Okay. Then we have Todd, please.
Thank you so much for participating. My name is Todd Berliner. So I have a question about teaching, and I wanted to hear your thoughts on two concerns that I've encountered in my own teaching as I, like so many other academics right now, are trying to revise our lectures and our courses and make them more inclusive, make them more diverse in terms of representation and other issues. So, and these two problems are as follows. So I'm not an expert in this issue, and I'm not used to speaking about things that I don't feel expertise in, but I am still desirous to engage these issues because of their social importance. So this poses kind of a problem for me, you know, being an authority in the classroom, and so I want to know if you know of any strategies for that. And a related issue is I have been trying to revise lectures and create new lectures that are addressing some of these social issues. Again, I'm not an expert, but I'm also nervous about doing so. And for instance, I've written a lecture on blackface in Hollywood cinema that, I mean, people just couldn't believe I was even taking it on because the images are so offensive. And I didn't know how best to manage that and was sort of nervous about my own safety, you know, my own status as an academic, and worried about complaints. And so I consulted a diversity trainer. I gave the lecture to the diversity trainer. It was really a lot of work because of my lack of expertise and because of the sensitivity of the topic. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on those two matters. Thank you.
I can go first. I have a very pragmatic suggestion. I hate to give Facebook any more business than they already have, but I would recommend that if you're not on Facebook, you get on Facebook and you join a group called Teaching Media. Teaching Media has 4,400 members on it, and it is a terrific repository of information and allied thinking. And people will go on there with problems like you're describing all the time. hey, what would you recommend for this topic from this particular perspective? And you'll get more answers than you can use. Let's just put it that way. So it's a decent resource. That's the practical thing. I also would just say, I don't know. I think I'm going to stop there.
I would just say it's one, thank you for putting in all of that effort and time and care into wanting to get it right in your classroom. But even as a Black woman teaching in the South in the United States, it's an anxiety-ridden experience for me as well. And I think that's because we care about getting it right. And we will not always get it right. I think that's important to recognize right off the bat. I think that we are human. We are fallible, even as professors and experts in the front of our classrooms. But I think that we can learn from those experiences as well. When there are areas that I feel less comfortable discussing with my students because of a lack of expertise, I will try to find a guest speaker who has the expertise. And Zoom and Teams has allowed for us to make that really, really easy. And I learn from them. I engage in conversation with them before they come into the classroom. I engage with conversation with them after the visit, as well as during the visit. In that particular instance, I'm a student as well. So I do what I can to learn from those experiences. I also think that it's important to also learn from our students. When we're struggling for examples, when we're struggling with certain aspects, sometimes our students know a little bit more than we do. I know that's hard to admit, but we can learn from them as well. And I think that we have to embrace that give and take that we have with our students in the classroom. We may not always get it right, but we're going to get it right eventually. And 9 times out of 10, the students are going to be better off for it.
Yes,
that's so nicely said. I just would like to add one thing. So in my experiences, it's possible to tell the students what Meghan just said, like, we are human, we are fallible. If I will make mistakes in dealing with that, but if I don't try, I won't learn, and nothing will change. And the other thing would be to, I mean, what has helped me a lot was the exchange with mostly younger colleagues, younger faculty who were much more had much more experience in dealing with DEI issues than I did, and I learned a lot from them, and I tried reading a lot and so on. So I think it's possible to prepare, and so that the mistakes are not too big.
I just want to amplify that. I'm on an ad hoc working group on freedom of expression right now. And, you know, as you might imagine, controversial topics within classes is one of the issues that we've been talking about. And it's so important that students be encouraged to express their opinions, frustrations, without fear of consequence, in a sense. It doesn't mean that there should be free of disagreement, but disagreement's okay. And being called out on something is okay, because you're gonna, if the teacher makes it clear it's okay, that we're all gonna make mistakes here, and we're going to learn from them and forgive each other. The other very pragmatic bit of advice that I'm reminded of is that the one thing I occasionally have seen in media classes or film classes is just what I call a parade of depressing stimuli. And how important it is, I think, not only for student morale and student engagement, but also I think they'll learn more is if you balance, not necessarily balance, but you make sure you have positive examples along with negative ones. So, you know, you don't have to subject them to Birth of a Nation. But if you do, then let them watch Black Panther. Right? I mean, it needs to be, they need to understand that there's a range, and then they need to be able to provide the analysis about why they're different and why one is both, why one might be, a historical achievement, but still racist as hell, right? But I think, part of my experience is dealing with and teaching women's studies classes is that you can't leave the students totally depressed at the end of every class period. They have to find hope. They have to see opportunities for optimism about change is possible and that there are positive images out there.
It's good to close on this very optimistic remark. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the physical and virtual audience for listening and asking questions. And on behalf of the DI committee and SCSMI, I would like to express our deepest gratitude to Meghan, Edward, and Jens for their time, the illuminating manner they presented their research to us, and their support for our cause.
Thank you.
We would also like to thank the conference organizers Hector and the IT support technician Carles, who have been amazingly helpful with facilitating these hybrids and broadcast events. And as this roundtable has been broadcast and recorded, we intend to keep it publicly available and add research publications from our speakers to the video, so creating a micro DEI research repository that hopefully will grow in the future. Would also like to reiterate that this roundtable is supposed to be the kickstart for a process that promotes a dialogue between disciplines that have researched DEI themes, but that have not yet intersected. So in the tradition of John Brockman's third culture, we particularly aim to build bridges between the sciences and the humanities, especially cultural studies, in order to pursue research that has positive social impacts. Both fields study marginalization, stigma, stereotypes, and intergroup boundaries in relation to media, but quite ironically, as I mentioned earlier, was it for me? Okay. So quite ironically, there are deep entrenched intergroup boundaries between disciplines in terms of stereotyping and stigma. So we are closing with a set of questions that have emerged during this roundtable, which we hope will provide the impetus for building bridges between these disciplines and trigger similar events related to DEI and media research in future. So the first question is, how can the two spectatorship approaches of one, single-bodied audience, and two, a socially segmented audience, inform each other in relation to analyzing diverse audiences' responses? Two, how do cognitive film and social psychology scholars address themes from cultural studies, and vice versa? How do cultural studies address questions posed by cognitive and social psychology? Three, how can different disciplines who research diversity and inclusion in and through media be brought together to discuss multi-method approaches? The next one is, how can we combine and reconcile spectatorship and audience research approaches for addressing DEI issues? Don't worry, just two more. How do we approach research in terms of the researcher's bias, perspective, and personal experience? I think that's something that is really important, to look at your own thick description of your own research, to use Clifford Geertz's term. And last one, how can we study audiences in terms of simultaneously the in-groups, but also the out-groups perspective and the impact of media on both? So on this note, thank you very much, and wherever you currently are, we wish you a pleasant evening, night, or day.